Our first speaker is Richard Engle, and this guy has been super involved in grassroots politics in Oklahoma for a long time. He actually founded the Oklahoma County Christian Coalition. He's a two-term city councilman. He's was the regional coordinator for the Pat Robertson campaign. He's been to the national convention as a delegate a couple of times. And he's also the vice president of the Oklahoma Conservative Political Action Committee, which does a lot as a major force in politics here in Oklahoma. He's also the president of Bell West America, who, by the way, I would like to thank for helping make this day possible. So I want you to really give it up today for Richard Engle.
One giant leap. Okay. Thank you, Lucas, so much for your very kind words, and thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share just a bit of my journey. I was your typical Bible-believing, church-attending, non-smoking, pro-life, traditional marriage creationist, pro-Israel, God and country, values-voting conservative Christian. Hallelujah! And I still am. Woo. But I thought that libertarians and Ron Paul supporters were pot-smoking, tax-evading, godless anarchists. I was wrong. Well, maybe some of them are, but I don't know of any of them. And I know that Ron Paul is not. I've had the privilege to visit with him on a few occasions, and I must say that he is a man of impeccable character. I have a friend, he's here today, a fellow Christian, a supporter of Congressman Paul's presidential campaign in 2008. He gave me a one-sentence challenge that rocked my world, my worldview. He said that he wanted me to consider the moral superiority of liberty. That very suggestion that liberty could be morally superior was revolutionary. I thought of myself as a limited government conservative, but I really only wanted government limited to the things I wanted. I'd comforted myself that in the premise that the things I wanted were good. I wanted government to prohibit people from doing immoral things and to encourage moral things. It didn't bother me that some people had different ideas on what was good and what was bad. After all, I was right. They were wrong. I wanted a government that was faithful to the ideals of our founding fathers. They were steeped in Christian values. As I studied their words, especially out of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, in the light of that very challenging phrase, the moral superiority of liberty, I came to realize that it didn't matter if my moral standards were the right ones or not. Our nation was not built on the premise of imposed values. Indeed, I came to realize that any imposed morality loses all virtue. If moral actions are not the product of a moral man, then those actions have little true value. Amen. More importantly, government itself must be held to a moral standard. Thomas Jefferson penned in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, we're all very familiar with those words. But the next part's critical, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. We are thus informed that government has a job. The job is to secure our rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson continues the document by explaining that when government does pretty much anything else, it's a tyranny, a despotism. Our federal Constitution grants specific powers from the people to government, and it prohibits it from assuming any others. When I wanted government to do something good that was not specified in the Constitution, I was calling on it to usurp authority it did not rightly have. Now, how could I call for government to usurp, to steal authority illegally? Well, I could not. With my new understanding of the proper role of government, I needed to examine the candidates for the highest office in that government, the President of the United States. Now, any conservative Christian can easily find unacceptable those amoral establishment candidates who have flip-flopped on vital issues and violated every principle of conservative ideology. And it takes little imagination for you to realize that I'm speaking of Misters Romney, Huntsman, and Gingrich. Among the others, excepting Congressman Paul, one can find an uncomfortable blend of admirable stands on the one hand and incredible violations of principle on the other. One could wonder how those inexplicably inconsistent politicians could have the gall to even ask for our votes. But when one considers the one candidate who has been consistent, honest, true to the Constitution, well, we find we need to examine some of his more extraordinary ideas. Ron Paul is clearly pro-life. He has a perfect pro-life record in Congress. But he does not favor a constitutional amendment on the issue. He wants it returned to the states, as it was prior to Roe v. Wade. This, I will suggest, is a prime example of his consistency. The unborn life is a human life, and every life deserves protection like all others. The states have always prosecuted those who commit homicide, as the Constitution reserves that role to them. There is no reason or experience to suggest that the federal government would do a better job of protecting innocent life than would the states. Indeed, experience suggests that big centralized government is worse at most things than state or local government.
Right.
Another issue that Christians often are concerned about when it comes to Ron Paul. Ron Paul does not want to give U.S. monetary aid to Israel, or any other nation for that matter. Some have suggested that's somehow anti-Semitic. To suggest that we must give cash to a friendly Israel or condemn ourselves as favoring Jewish genocide is absurd on its face. Let me add that we do no favors to Israel when we put their whole nation into a state of dependency, while giving equally to their enemies. Ron Paul favors Israeli sovereignty, something that those who wish to keep Israel dependent apparently do not. Now consider that and ask yourself, who really supports Israel? Ron Paul opposes the continuing infusion of our fine servicemen and women into foreign battlefields. His detractors often say that suggests he's against our military. It's interesting that he consistently garners more support from our members of the armed forces than do other candidates. And what of that verse in the Bible that says, if it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men? Now, when it's not possible, Congressman Paul suggests that we should follow the Constitution and actually declare a war. Now, I know it sounds extreme, but I agree that our government should abide by the supreme law of the land. I've heard that Ron Paul wants to make prostitution and drugs legal. I've also heard that he favors gay marriage. Well, Ron Paul voted for the Defense of Marriage Act and co-sponsored the Marriage Protection Act. Ron Paul favors traditional one-man, one-woman marriage. Ron Paul does not want to make prostitution legal for a very strange reason. It already is. There is no federal law against prostitution, and none is needed. Only one state has legal prostitution, and there it's only in a few counties. This is another example of the absurdity of the assumption that we must have a national law against something. The federal government has no constitutional role in the issue. Similarly, the Constitution does not enumerate a power to the federal government to prohibit or control drugs. Now, if you want to make a federal issue of it, then we have an app for that. It's called an amendment. And you can propose one to the Constitution to prohibit drugs, but until then, let's be honest. The Constitution does not give the federal government such a power. In the meantime, the states can do what the federal government may not. There is no need to create a national standard on every issue, any more than there's a need to create a world government to meddle in our lives. There are a myriad other issues of concern to conservative Christians like myself. With each and every one, I believe you will find that Ron Paul is truly on the moral side. Ron Paul is the candidate for Christians, for America. Liberty is the morally superior standard. Ron Paul is the only liberty candidate. Finally, the issue that seems to stop so many voters from supporting Ron Paul. They say he's unelectable. Really? Ron Paul has been elected 12 times.